Jeremiah's there too.
Oh, I see. Oh, Jeremiah. Jeremy. Yes, he is.
Oh, okay.
Hey. A couple of things before we start. I remembered about an hour ago. Oh yeah, in the last class you guys asked about. I was going to go searching about why the cup in that second mystery of faith is capitalized and bread. Remember? So I was right. It came down to those two things. That it does point to it is a reference to Paul's letter to the Corinthians, right? And that. Remember I gave that lecture. Was the first time it was referenced, the Last Supper. It's not Corinthians 11. And then the idea of cup too. I realized because I was celebrating Mass on Monday and Wednesday. I use that. This is why good ritual helps, because sometimes you learn by actually just doing it more than reading. And I realized that the mystery of faith occurs after the consecration, right? So in other words, most things, and we know this as composers, whenever it has reference to God, or any of the three people, it's always capitalized. So it's that idea that it gives it more significance. The cup. It's not just a regular cup. It's not just a regular bread, but it has reference to Christ. Okay. And they use cup rather than chalice because that's what the present scriptural translation is. Right. The other thought, Jeremy, you asked that question before about you brought it up twice, and we really haven't addressed it yet about that idea, about Mass. Why can't it be like you were talking? You brought it up last time. Why? And I said we could talk about it at the end of class, but we really didn't because we didn't get to culture as much. We will talk about that. I mean, probably in the last class, I redid the syllabus, and I think I purposely left open that last class to bring in maybe another lecture or two. So, but we're going to come back to Mark Francis's book, and we'll talk about those questions that you brought up, Jeremy, as well, because I know you brought it up twice, at least. What was it again? Something along the lines like, why can't all the masses be in English or something like that? I don't think you said those words, but why can't it be the same so that wherever you go, it's experienced as the same? Am I correct or incorrect?
I'm not sure. I'll have to look back at my notes
Okay.
to see how I worded it. But I think I was bringing up how we've had this experiment of multiculturalism,
Yeah.
and having Mass in multiple languages, and we're inserting a part here in one language and a part here in another language.
Yeah.
And the majority of people don't speak those languages often.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it is, from my experience at least, in many conversations, many times the people that are opposed to having Latin in Mass are desiring to have other languages, but they don't speak those languages. Like they like having songs in Spanish, or they like hearing the Mass parts in Spanish. They don't speak Spanish. They don't know Spanish. They complained about, Latin when they didn't know it. It's confusing to me. Why were they so opposed to one language that they didn't know, and now they wanted another language?
Okay. So I think because I think Mark Francis touches upon that, but we can definitely break that even further. When we come back to it, I guess in a week and a half or 2 weeks, when we meet and come back to that book. Okay. But those are good questions. Excellent questions. And we did touch up a little bit upon it, I think, when we talked about the readings, how those were claimed. But I don't think we got into it in depth. So definitely. So thanks for that. And then, as you can see, let me share this screen. I redid the syllabus. Sorry about that. I didn't put the right day of the week, but I did put the right. It was funny. I looked back at my last course when I taught this 2 times ago, and I had the same thing. I had it on I had Monday for, it was different dates, of course, but everyone, I thought back then there was no confusion because it was presumed it was always going to be 2 days before, but the date was correct. So in light of, so I changed this just to reflect that. I changed Thursday, I changed Monday to Thursday for these two. These dates are the same, but like I said in that last email, we'll just continue that. If you want to add on anything, I'm not counting any points off for that if you didn't do it in time because of that typo. But if you want to do anything, we can continue that conversation on Saturday. Again, I see discussion forums as a living forum, to extend beyond it, even after the due date, if you ever want to revisit it. Okay, and I'll try to get back to those. So today, I usually spend time going through your discussion forums. I didn't get a time to do it because I really spent most of the day, I think 5 out of the 6 of you, at least within the last, before the last hour, turning your outline, and I responded to all your outlines. So that really took all day. And as you can see, I spent a lot of time doing some research for you. I gave each of you a lot of resources. I usually don't do that, but then I got the hint from Saturday's class. You might not have access to libraries or whatever it is, although you do have access to Amazon. So there might be a book or two that you might just want to purchase anyway. But in addition to that, this year I said, well, let me just, this summer at least, let me just give you some documents or resources to get you jump-started. They're my resources that I've done in my research. Of course, if you want to do your own research, please do that, and please use other resources. So they are biased because they're coming from me, the professor teaching this course. But ultimately, it's your paper, and if you want to use your own resources, that's great, as long as you let me know where they come from. Please do not quote Wikipedia, And even if you want to ask me whether you feel this is a credible one, pass it on, pass it by my thoughts, and I'll give you my professional thought at least. So anyway, so I did all that. What we can do for the first hour is I'd like to go through the introduction, mostly the introduction of the book, to make sure we're clarified at least where I'm coming from, and then as I through this, if there's anything that came up that you posted in your discussion that you want to bring into, as I go through this, please do. Okay. Also, for pedagogical reasons, I kind of said this before, I want to make sure that by the end of the first hour, actually, by the time of the end class, by the end of the class today, I want to make sure that everyone has, perhaps shared what they brought, what they contributed in the discussion forum. Okay, so if I haven't heard from you, I might call upon you to ask, what did you do? This way we can kind of discuss the discussion forum while I go through this this introduction and chapter 1 as well. Okay, how does that sound? The second hour, I'm going to show you that PowerPoint, so have that on hand, as well as the handout of the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy that was in the handout folder. All right, let me get out of this. Let's go back to the home screen. Okay, in fact, I'm going to get out. I'm not really presenting, so let me just go. Oh, here we go. Oh, you're all there. Okay. Like I don't have to share the screen at this point. One second. All right. So there's my opening story, and it was sort of it was meant to kind of show how a lot of people, a lot of Catholics, when they first meet God or first begin to understand God years later, it might actually have been outside of a church building. For example, I don't really remember my baptism, but my earliest memories are coming actually from people locations in this sense, and in this particular sense from Filipino locations. And as a starting point, these stories, these narratives kind of remain in, I think they remain in our hearts in our minds. And eventually, like anything, particularly with my family, and I was very privileged to have been grown up in a very Catholic family, my parents then shaped those early experiences to, into the early formation of what it means for me to eventually actually become a priest, and to see and then to go through the sacramental process per se. Did some of you share some of that? Like, what was your first moment that you remember? When you look in hindsight, it might have been an official liturgy too. I don't know. Maybe some of you. Especially if you were baptized as an adult, that's a different location than, let's say, a lot of children who might experience it more domestically, or maybe outside of the house.
Yeah, Father, I'll pipe up there. Really one of the first memories I've got is from First Communion, which was actually at St. Clair's Church right next to Santa Clara University there in Santa Clara. So that was when it had the altar rails, and it was, there had been, I think, some earthquake damage, so that church has been reconfigured or redone. But that was one of my first. I just remember riding my bike, locking it up on one of the poles outside of the church, near the school grounds, and going to the preparation, because I just lived down the street, a mile or two away. But yeah,
that's great.
I remember that. So
yeah, I guess you remember the church building. That's the beauty of church architecture. They become permanent, or I put those in parentheses, but fixtures, right? In our neighborhoods. Yeah. Anyone else?
Memory I have is not necessarily a first memory, but an early memory is also of my first communion. However, I was not in bicycle riding. I was about 10 miles out of town, so wasn't going to be riding my bike. But I remember waiting in line in my dress with my gloves and in front of the church. That church is still around. It's in Vacaville. However, since that time, it's been remodeled, so it looks a little different than when it did when the front facade, anyways, looks a little different. Well, actually, the whole thing looks a little different. But that's one of my first memories. I also have a memory of Father Bob, who during his ordination, just a brief memory during his ordination, and just having a moment of that.
Ordinations are kind of grand ceremonies.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mary. So then what I kind of do in the next section is, and by the way, I want you to think about that. One of the things I want you to start thinking about, what are your everyday worship practices? Okay, what are your everyday worship practices? And some of them might be official, some of them might be unofficial. You'll be surprised. In other words, one question I want to ask you is, what are the times and moments in your life that you respond to God? Or you respond to Jesus, or respond to the Holy Spirit. And then how do you express that? And so if it's intentional, remember worship, if it's intentional, you're aware of it, and you express it in different ways, then, what may they be? So start just thinking about that throughout the book too. And then, of course, as I do in the book, how does that relate then to Sunday Mass? Okay. So what I do starting in page 5, I kind of talk about how Roman Catholic teaching and theologians kind of looked at the word culture. I touched upon this before, this past Saturday, when we talked about, the understanding of culture per se. But we primarily looked at culture in a very, what most people would call a very anthropological lens. People like Clifford Geertz, as I talk about him, was really formative in looking at culture. And we would kind of see culture in this it would be sort of like that billiard balls model that we kind of would look at classically, just like the history of anthropology would be like the anthropologist coming down to Africa, seeing a tribe of Africans and saying, that's culture, that's an African culture. We would kind of see it as one boundary. This is what all Africans do. This is how they initiate each other. This is how they go through weddings. And this was the earliest understanding of culture. And Clifford Geertz, probably the most influential anthropologist, who really influenced a lot of the official teachings and a lot of the theologians, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, would kind of see culture that way. It would later be criticized because the criticism would come that, let's say, he would talk about the Balinese, people in Indonesia, and the idea was that the anthropologists would look at this group of Indonesians, and they would be having these cockfights, or they would be having these different rituals for the presidents or the leaders. And Clifford Geertz would then, through this method called thick description, would say, you see the way they're doing this? That means this is what you had to go through an analysis, go to the deeper meaning. This means for them, when they play this game, or when they do this ritual, or celebrate this this religious ritual, whatever. This is what Indonesians feel about that particular ritual. The critique came, of course, because he became so focused on just, let's say, this one game, that he didn't realize how the activities and elements and components outside of the game came to form that actual ritual. Am I making any sense? It became too exclusively focused on just what he saw, what the anthropologist sees, per se. And it's not to say there's no truth there. The thing is, it wasn't complete. And so this led to a lot of stereotyping. This would be like me going to one of your parishes on a given Sunday, and I go in, and I realize, even if I'm there for a few times, I realize, this is what they do, St. Albert's in whatever city, and I write down my observations, that's thick description. I'm trying to analyze what it is. Now, the good anthropologist, and this is what we became better at later on, I wouldn't just go to Sunday liturgy to understand how people come to understand the Mass. I would need to really maybe do a 2 or 3 year study. I would have to talk about, I might have to visit the individual people who go to Mass there, find out how their everyday worship is influencing their understanding of Sunday liturgy. In other words, it isn't as clean and perfect as most people might come to think, And so this developed the whole area of ethnography. Now, ethnography is really, that's the discipline behind this book, would be, I'm there in St. Albert's, and there's Judy, per se, and ethnography would be more, how do I bring in Judy's feelings, thoughts, and understanding of Mass so that I could actually put it in a book and footnote it? Or let me speak to the pastor. Let me speak to Father Bob Bylan and ask him, hey, Father Bob, ask him, when you preached that homily, what did you mean? And usually his interpretation, believe it or not, as some studies have shown, is usually vastly different than what people actually hear when it comes to preaching homilies. Or the selections of music. A music director might choose this song, but they actually hear something else that's different. Okay? Same thing with official statements. An official statement might say something, right? But then how people interpret that might be different than what the officials or the actual writers or the committee who actually wrote it, actually what they had in mind. So ethnography would be that disciplinary tool of how do I get to the fuller picture of what transpires not only within, but without and around a sacred site, in this case, and then correlate that data. And what do we come up with? And so what anthropology did when it came to culture is that it tended to what we call the centralized cultural groups. Now, when you essentialize means that I simply got the essence of what this particular group is. If it's done negatively, it's called stereotyping. And if it leads to some kind of oppression, it's called racism or cultural elitism, or what Mark Francis kind of talked about, that ethnocentrism per se. It's not that there might not be some truth there, but the truth is actually more complex than we think. And it actually might not actually be the truth, because once you actually see the larger picture, then that might actually change the fundamental meaning of what's behind the what you see in front of you, or what's written in ink on paper. Am I making any sense? All right. Any thoughts about this, what I said? Because that's kind of a theoretical framework that we're looking at. And do you see what's going to go on when I then choose about 8 to 10 subjects to be part of this? I want to find out, how do they look at this understanding of Mass as a source and summit? So that's really what page 6 is talking about. It's talking about the past approaches to culture. What I do then is I talk about on page 12, I talk about then, and we're going to be talking about this in the next hour, this whole phrase of source and summit, which a lot of theologians and officials have kind of misinterpreted, and it led to different mispractices of that term. So actually, I'm going to talk about that in the next hour. I'm going to skip that and kind of come on page 13 and kind of just say what I kind of do here is that the anthropological approach to culture, remember, culture are the meaning-making practices and values of a group of people, right? So there is some boundary there. But you can't say that everyone in that group actually practices what the majority might actually believe, And what actually happens when you study the history of culture or any kind of institution, including the Roman Catholic institution, you actually see that the boundaries have always been changing. Even the interpretation of what we call to be the essence or the substantiated essence, theological teaching, interpretations sometimes get nuanced, right? Because anything we say or express, even about God and religion, will always be culturally conditioned. It will always be historically conditioned. It will always be through a particular culture or group, it says it. At the same time, to kind of converse the opposite of that, there are different patterns that remain the same, different larger, even deeper issues that remain the same. But any opinion we have will always be culturally conditioned. And conversely, at the same time, this is where counterculture comes in. Not everything in every culture is compatible with the Bible teaching and the tradition of our faith, right? So it's always going to be this interplay between not everything in culture is compatible, and that's where evangelization and proclaiming the reign of God comes in. But then anything anyone says, even doctrines and even official church teachings, will still be culturally conditioned. I mean, in other words, anything we say or express in any institution, even in our human practices, will forever be bound to cultural interpretation. So this is where the Spirit moves in revelation. We can talk about that whole process per se. But so in other words, I'm looking at then, what I want to do then is rather than go to anthropology of culture, I go to the sociology of culture. What sociologists do, this is a classic way of looking at the difference between anthropology and sociology. Anthropology usually studies what they do. In other words, it usually is how classically, nowadays, a lot of these disciplines are very actually blended together. But classically, an anthropologist would be me studying what that group does, per se. Sociology, in general, very general, because I'm gonna actually dynamite this whole thing I'm telling you right away after I explain this. But in classical sociology, it was more like not so much what they do, but what do we do? What are our cultural practices, and why do we do what we do? Now today, after 1970, what happened was both of these disciplines kind of borrow from one another. Okay, but my point is, rather than studying, looking at a different culture group, objectively looking at them, I wanted to study, in my case, US culture, which is, so in other words, there might be a sociological practice of culture. Let's talk about consumerism, that a lot of collective little subcultural groups practice, whether you're African American, Filipino American, upper class, lower, you know what I'm saying? Male, female. So in other words, sociology looks at all those different various practices that various anthropological cultures practice. Am I making any sense? I don't know if that's clear. Anthropology classically always just looked at one particular cultural group. Sociology looked at everything that goes, that not only that one cultural group practices, but maybe a lot of cultural groups in a particular society, in a social setting per se. And so for me, I needed to learn from the sociology of culture that looks at, so sociology of culture looks at things like, it might look at media. That's something that all anthropological groups might practice. You know what I'm saying? It might look at consumerism. It might look at finance, it might look at financial institutions, social processes. It might look at politics, because within politics you could find various subculture groups. And what that did to me is that it kind of opened up a whole world of other tools I could then draw upon to kind of find out how these particular lay people come to understand liturgy as the source and summit of their lives. Or is it for them, right? That was one of the questions I asked them all. I met with them for about, it was a 2-year process, and I met with them several times. But sometimes I would ask them straight offhand, what is the source of your life? And they would give me various answers. I then would say, well, this is what the official church says. So I didn't bring in the official church right away. I wanted to find out their location first. Because as an ethnographer, I want to kind of get their approach. I thought this would be useful data, especially, my community, the Paulists, we're our biggest ministry is evangelization. That's what we're kind of known for. So it's more like, how do we evangelize? And we'll talk about with the nuns next week. How do we evangelize? We have to kind of we have to understand where they're coming from first. It doesn't mean you have to agree, but you have to start coming to know where they're located. Otherwise anything you say is going to be a waste of time, right? So what I talk about there on page 13 is more about that whole discipline. That's a preview. And then I kind of just give the outline of the book. Okay. So, all right. So from what I just said, is there anything there that I might be able to clarify? Oh, okay. So I guess it's clear. The method's pretty clear. What I'm going to do, and what you're going to read is I'm going to correlate all that data into, okay, well, once we correlate, once we get their perspectives, and then once we put that with the official teaching, and then once we get that with the lived practice, what do they actually do during Mass or during their actual prayers? You correlate all that data, then it's like, you get a more well-rounded response as to liturgy as a source and summit of Christian life. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you also get to, what I like about this study is that you also get to know where they're coming from, whether you agree or not. You just have to know why they're doing what they do. Okay. that's really the work of a social scientist, the social scientific aspect of this whole book.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Of course you may.
It seems like I think I'm putting the pieces together as far as, you're looking at teachings, you're looking at the experiences, you're looking at the current culture and whatnot. And it seems, from my perspective, from my experience, that the actual teachings of the church have a lesser priority than the experience or the current culture or practice of the people. It overrides it.
I think most people would agree with you. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm saying I think most people wouldn't know about number 10, the Constitution and the Sacred Liturgy. They wouldn't even know the Latin title of that, right? Or the So I think most people, including my mom, she doesn't know. I don't think she even knows like some of the teachings of the church in her head.
Right.
She might have lived it and she might have been enculturated in her Filipino culture. But I think most people don't read documents.
Sure.
I mean, I think what you're touching upon, Jeremy, is that's one of the threads here. How do we better catechize and how do we better teach? But I think it's a high percentage that most people have never even heard of the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy. Have you heard about that before this course?
Yeah, Sacro Sanctum Concilium. Right?
Yeah,
yeah.
But if you were to ask like 100 Catholics out there.
No, but I agree with you 100%. You ask 100 Catholics out there, they're going to be like, I don't know any church document, let alone that one. Like what?
Yeah. Now they might have known. I mean, maybe I don't know, but maybe because I don't want to judge the people who taught them. Maybe they taught them the principles behind the documents without mentioning the names. I don't think most teachers will ever mention Sacrosancta Concilium. But maybe they do.
I don't think most Catholics would if you say, do you have your own catechism of the Catholic Church?
Yeah. They might not even know what that is.
Exactly.
I think they may have heard of catechism, actually.
Right.
I don't know whether they've actually read that document. What's the experience of others?
That's true from my perspective as well. In fact, my parents have a copy of the catechism because I gave it to them. They haven't read it yet. It's in a bookcase. But I mean, yeah. But I've got to admit, I didn't really know about it until I started really delving more into my faith about 15 years ago, and so that's when I became familiar with it. So if if our brothers and sisters out there are going to church but not furthering their knowledge of the church outside of Mass, then more than likely they don't know.
No. Or they forget, because maybe they were taught. I don't know, but maybe they forget.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. In grammar, I went to grammar school 3rd through 8th grade in a parochial school and Catholic school. I couldn't tell you much about I know I learned the faith and I know I had my confirmation in 8th grade, but I couldn't really tell you what they taught.
Yeah.
So, I think it was more, I don't know.
Yeah. What about Benny and Nabor in Hispanic communities? Do you, I don't know, but in your catechesis, I don't know if you've ever been experiencing that as a catechist, but do you talk about the documents? Or do you talk about more, I don't know, the faith? How might it be different or the same as what we're talking about here?
My experience with my culture with the Hispanic people, I think a few of the groups, they might talk a little bit of some of the documents in a very basic way. Like Jeremy was saying, even the catechist of the church, many people, they don't even have those documents. So that's on some of the people that belong to groups, you know. But
Yeah.
the other regular people, they only go to mass, they probably even in a worse position.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
very general that we have. I don't know about Benny.
That's right. So what I'm going to do here, thanks, Nabor, what I'm going to do here is primarily take an official statement, in this case, liturgy is the source and summit of Christian life, and say, I don't want to say regular Roman Catholic. I mean, that's qualified to these particular 8 or 10 people, because sometimes I did married couples, that kind of counts as 2 people. How do they come to understand that phrase? You see? I mean, there could have been a million phrases, but I'm a liturgist, and that's something we hold dear. That liturgy, the Eucharist is the most important Eucharist or liturgy we could ever celebrate, right?
Can I say something, Father?
Of course you may, Benny.
I'm going to be honest here that...
yeah, that's what I want.
Well, what you're saying has a lot of... it brought me to... I'm learning, like, this is baby steps for me, you know. But I think that what brought me to learn more my faith, you know who brought me to learn more about my faith? It is the Protestantism, the fundamentalist, and those who were questioning my faith. And I've learned more in my whole life as Catholic. I've learned more from those who have been converted from Protestantism.
Yeah.
Like Scott Hahn, I've been learning a lot from those who have been converted to Catholicism, because actually, if I were to become a catechist, I will be an apologist. How to say apologist?
An apologist. Yeah.
Apologist.
Oh yeah.
Because that has taken me to not only question my faith and go to the roots of my understanding about certain different objections, but what we were discussing with you in class about the Vatican II, why is that very important and relevant to our days, even after 50 years of Vatican II? I think that this ecumenical council brought us to because of these different changes that after the World War II happened, and the church had to reconsider all the practices, and essentially shaping the modern Catholic Church. So, and the willingness to operate in this contemporary realm. So, you know, this changes in the liturgy. Not much about that. Not much about doctrinal changes, but I take it more like in a pastoral approach of re-evaluating, appreciating, understanding what we have. So even though there were people that were against it because they had, they're gonna change these moral teachings about contraception, the sex, or all male priesthood now gonna change it. There was a lot of confusion. It was not about that. It was about recapturing the truth. And so all the things that you're saying right now, if I want to paraphrase what you're saying, Father, this in anthropology and sociology and this approach to
ethnography.
Yeah, it's something really interesting, because that can give us the tools to reevaluate and probably energize or revamp our faith to the people, to the masses.
That's right. And it's, I want to also qualify, it's a tool. In the end, in the realm of faith and theology, I still have to bring it back to theology and back to God, right? Otherwise, if I stay in the social scientific tools and what do the sociologists of religion say about this and what does this person do, then I'm not really a theologian. In fact, you know, I don't have to be Catholic or Jew. I mean, I could just study this, and I could be atheist and study this from a social scientific perspective. So in the end, what I do at the end of the book is well, this has to ultimately go back to what I call the divine initiative. You see, and that's something that I feel like, you know, in other words, part of what went on after Vatican II is that, and even before Vatican II, for the last 200 years, since the Enlightenment, we've been borrowing all these social scientific tools, right? And we're expanding horizontally, right? And you know, and it's not evil. It made us really get to the deeper understandings of what our faith was in many ways. Thank God for scriptural studies. Thank God for Vatican II, which wasn't, most of the things, believe it or not, as much as a lot of people might think, are not really new. They're actually traditions from the from before the Council of Trent into the early Christian, into the first few centuries. You know, but we only got to that because of the social scientific tools. But if we let social scientific tools have the last say, then this isn't theology, nor is it religion per se, because religion is about theology. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, I mean, Father, this is Steve. I think that's, just from my observations, that seems like what has happened quite a bit. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, it's been driven by the personal experience, like Jeremy was saying earlier. It's driven by the tools, and I look at, and we were studying in our classes we've taken so far over the last couple of years, biblical studies, just like with the sociological tools and methods, historical critical method, for many, not all, but for many people, and especially in the Protestant realm, that was elevated. That became the be-all, end-all. Oh, Jesus didn't really exist for some of these people that were studying the Bible, just because they were focusing, like you said, on the tools and the methods. I think that's the same thing that does happen with sociological tools too. Say, hey, look, everyone's doing this thing. That's really what should drive the train, so to speak, rather than what has been passed on from a theological perspective from the saints, the doctors, and the church, which really that's the ultimate authority for us as Catholics, right?
Well, I mean, we have to, yeah, you're right, because I think what happens, and there are so many scholars out there, and they don't really care about theology, actually, you know, but yeah, we can still borrow their tools as long as we bring it back. And maybe what you're saying is, sometimes people do that. Now, sometimes I think even at the lay level, sometimes people might hear about Oprah Winfrey. I used to watch Oprah Winfrey while I was exercising. And I like a lot of the things she says, and I don't like other things. But in the end, she's not my religious faith. However, a lot of the things she said are really good too, right? Now the thing is, if I just focus on Oprah Winfrey, I'm using that in quotes. But then don't bring it back to, well, what does this say or what does it not say about my Catholic faith, based on scripture, tradition, and worship and a liturgical life and all that, right? And the idea of ecclesiology in my community, then I'm just going to leave the church. I mean, because then it's not, you know. And so this is part of the things I'm going to talk about next week when we talk about nuns. So, I mean, it's a question I have for all of you. So what do you do about that as ministers in the church? So how do you confront that situation? You know, if you yell at them, that's not going to do anything. They're free to make their own choice, whether you like it or not. This is not the colonial time when you get to convert a whole nation, and if they don't convert, you kill them, as they did in the past. People can make freedom of choice today. That's part of the postmodern context, whether we like it or not. And it's actually a good thing for people to make their own choice, right? But from your positions as ministers, how do you then evangelize that? I mean, these are the things
Father, that this is a way of reading the signs of times and adjusting where we are willing or able to make this type of adjustment. About reading the signs of times, and this is this way, like the Vatican II, like renewing the church, the universal call to holiness, and the how they call it, Father, there's a word for that, a resourceman. The resourceman is which means return to the sources. I think that something is happening in our parish. Just a little brief testimony that the Catholic Men Fellowship, and the Legion of Mary, they want to go and participate in Latin Mass. Why? Because they have discovered the beauty of it. They have discovered that there's something beautiful, the reverence, the way that the people approach communion, and the rail, all different things. So for me, that is something that they have discovered. It's not that it was lost or that we are rejecting it, but we need to rediscover and see the beauty of it, and then let's appropriate or ownership. Take ownership.
Okay, so one of the things coming out of my book, and it applies to all of us too, that when people go outside of the norms of any institution, it's because the institution is not providing them the means for that. So people who go, like what you're saying, they're going to the Latin Mass because maybe that's saying something that either society or even the church is not providing for that, per se, and vice versa. So, and in the pick and choose culture, they're going to those. So as a sociologist, you have to ask yourself, why are they doing that? So now before 100 years ago, if you did not understand, or you weren't getting fulfilled during official liturgy, the Mass, you develop popular religion. In other words, the people then create their own religious links to God rather than go to Mass. This is what the liturgical movement was about. They wanted to get people back into going to Mass and be participating, conscious, and all that. So my point is, today, people are developing their popular religion, but it's not in a European sense of Fatima and Lourdes. They're just leaving the church and finding it elsewhere on the internet. That's their popular religion, because those are the tools that are available to them. And we're going to talk about that more next week. But my point is, whenever an institution, any institution, political or religious, if it does not meet the needs of people, people go elsewhere. And it doesn't mean, though, that we can't be critical or countercultural to some of the practices too. I'm just saying a fact. People will simply go elsewhere because they could.
Well, Father, can I ask a question here on what you just mentioned? So I would expect, or I'm just guessing, but it wasn't, the popular devotions didn't just pop up only because people weren't getting what they wanted, I guess, in liturgy, but wasn't it out of love too? I imagine, that some of this is driven by the Holy Spirit, people responding for the other parts of their life besides the hour or two that they're at Mass.
Absolutely. No, it's true. It is true. I mean, it's very good. The fact that it's the inspiration of the Holy Spirit developing new forms of worship that maybe the official liturgy did not consider. Once in this case, and all the studies, I think the second book talks about that. In this case, the official liturgies didn't meet the affective, emotional needs of the common people. Which is why the idea of devotion to Mary, or the Sacred Heart of Mary, or seeing the bleeding heart, they can relate with that. Or seeing the wounds of Christ, they can relate with that. Or going on their knees for a procession, kind of using their bodies as a location for worship and feelings and affectivity and all that. The heady Latin Mass was not doing it for them. So in other words, the Spirit was kind of invigorating and making their own, kind of inspiring them to come up with their own popular means, basically. And I think that's what's going on with a lot of liturgies, not just Latin. It might be other forms. It might be various styles of music. It might be various styles of gesture or words. People go elsewhere, or they just go out of the church. If they just don't practice the faith, or they combine various religions and spiritualities, as you're going to see. I think in one of the other chapters, I think what you read next week, we'll kind of talk about how people kind of bring all these things together, because that's just the world we live in, because they could, right? Right.
I
What
think
what I don't want you to do, I didn't want you to read the next two chapters because I wanted to assign you less pages to read because I know we only have like 2 more classes to go, and I want you to kind of focus now on your final paper. But if you do have time, you could certainly read through chapter 2 and 3. What I primarily do is what I just kind of talked about here, that history between popular religion and official liturgy, and why there was this demarcation between the two. But then I also talk about the history of this term, source and summit. I'm going to be looking at this term, source and summit of Christian life. What was the history of that? Because even though it appears in number 10 in the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy, it goes back a few hundred years. Well, what that chapter talks about is how the official leaders and theologians for the past 200, 300 years were always trying to hierarchically, for good reason, place where does official liturgy like the Mass, which is the most important liturgy we celebrate, how do we interrelate that with a person praying a rosary? Well, how do we interrelate that with definitely not official, like how do we interrelate that with a person who wears a medal with a two-headed elf? How do we interrelate that with pilgrimages? So what happens is that the official church began to correlate both of these for the last 200 years, trying to create some kind of hierarchy, particularly because the faithful were not seeing the Mass as a source and summit, as really a central part of their lives. So part of it was promoting the Mass, particularly when they wanted to, as I talked about with the liturgical movement, because there was a promotion of connecting the Mass to everyday life. There was also simultaneously a Mass of placing it above all other liturgies, per se. Because again, people were not seeing that as really the center of their lives. They were kind of doing the popular religiosities more so. So that's what that chapter talks about. And again, I don't want you to read it all. It's kind of dry data, but you can go back to it if you want and kind of just get a taste of that. All right? Anything else before we go for a break? And then we're going to go into the PowerPoint. All right. Did you read the little bios of the subjects? Page 25, the participants.
Yep.
Anything strike you there?
There's really a range of people. Some people, will go to Mass once in a while. Other people, it permeates their life, and it's the whole range. Yeah.
I formed a committee at St. Agnes of with the pastor and 4 other people to kind of, we went through a list of like 50 people. And given it was a 2-year project, I wanted to kind of focus on a cross-section from people like Helen Rosario, who reminds me of my mom, actually, in one end of the spectrum. And then I definitely wanted to get some millennials there. They might go to Mass once in a while. I forget, was it like once every 2 or 3 months they might go. And their attitudes to another person who gets kind of Edwin Williams, who kind of got through this through AA. I mean, this is very real life. A lot of Catholics do it in different ways. Jude Penland. So I wanted a good cross section of people, And anything we say, have to be qualified. And this book is just based on those 8 people. If I do 1 million people, it might be different. It might be different data per se. So I always have to qualify that this is also, they live here in the Bay Area. That might be different than if I did this in New York City. It might be different if I did it in South Dakota or Florida, So you have to realize when you read any of this, it has to be qualified to this. This is just the result of these people, And of course, I have my own bias of how I'm interrelating all these things myself. Right. So part of the idea of a scholar is to know I have my own biases, and I have my own education, and I have my own worldviews. So that comes here as well. How does the ethnographer contribute or contribute to what we might perceive to be objective data, when in fact it's also very subjective. All right, let's take a 10-minute break. It's 7:56 now, so about what, like 6 after, 5 after, 6 after, we'll come back. And then I'm going to go into the PowerPoint and have that handout ready with the Constitution and the Sacred Liturgy. We're going to continue this discussion, I think, with the PowerPoint as well.
Marie.
Hello.
Cookies.
Sorry, I was reading.
Hot out of the oven.
Oh, cookies, yum. You'll have to bring some to class next time.
Cookies. I'm getting hungry. I didn't have dinner. What kind of cookies?
Chocolate chip.
Oh, stop it.
I love those. It's a classic.
I'll say.
Brain food.
Yes.
Very good. I hear someone eating cookies. Oh no, that's Marie. You're sucking on a candy, is it?
I am. It's a lemon drop.
Oh, something's telling
I'm
me
muted.
lemon's your favorite flavor.
Yes, lemon is on the high,
Yeah,
on the top of towards the top of the list. Absolutely.
top of the taste list.
Yeah. Now, tree ripened apricots.
Oh,
Can't beat those. Not the ones you buy in the store that taste like nothing, but the tree ripened ones.
like
Now,
the ones in your backyard?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Lucky
those
you.
are. Yeah.
Lucky you. Yeah.
Well, it's got to produce fruit. It's still a young tree, so I'm waiting.
Oh yeah. Okay, we're back. Thanks. Have that handout on the Constitution. I'm going to refer to that at one point. And then I'm going to go over this. Well, I had to put you on share. 1 second. I'm going to go over the PowerPoint. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
All right. So let me diminish you here. All right, there we go. Okay, so I even changed the title and put that in the new revised syllabus. But you know what I wanted to do here is that I wanted to just go over, gosh, I don't know the name of the chapter for Peter Fun. Again, you could read this by yourself, but it's basically chapter 4. This is a summary of it, and I'm not asking you to read it, but you know, you might want to read it beyond this lecture per se. So we're kind of skipping the next 2 chapters so that I could just kind of give this lecture an overview of some of these deep theological thought per se. But one of the first questions I want to ask you is, what is the source? So who or what is the source of your Christian life? And I mean, I interviewed about 50 people from my book in various ways, but a lot of them I would ask them this question: what would some of you? How would some of you answer this?
God.
Yeah, God. What was that? I heard God. Christ, did you say? Yeah. Okay. Any others?
I say Christ.
Yeah. I'd say Christ too. Actually, I'm such a geeky theologian. I say the triune God. You know, but but sometimes I say also the Holy Spirit, at least for me. Any other thoughts or answers? In some ways, it's asking who is your God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because some people have different gods with a small g, you know? That's another point of preaching, I always say, whenever I preach about that. Who is your God? And how does it, how does it relate to anything else you do, per se? Now, some people, it was interesting, a lot of parents I met, it was interesting, some of them would just say, they're taking care of their children. Sometimes I wasn't quite sure how they interpreted my question, but it was always interesting to just find out when they saw that question, how they answered it. A lot of people did say God right away. Do you know this prayer? We say it at the end of the rosary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean, I don't know, I guess you got this from my introduction, but we prayed the rosary every single day growing up. Every single day since I was 5 years old until the time I left to study in music school and all. It was every 365 days a year. And as was kind of typical, at the end of the rosary, you then have all these prayers. So even as a child, there were times I really didn't want to be there. And after the rosary ended, sometimes I was like, oh, now we have 25 other prayers to do. Well, this is one of them. But some theologians would even look at this, and there's a whole history behind this. They would look at this prayer, and they would kind of revisit it again. Because we say, Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, hail our life, our sweetness, and our hope. To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this vale of tears. Turn then, most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us. And after this exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus, O merciful, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary. But look at that first phrase. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope. And so that's a question I ask you. Is Mary our life? Is Mary your life, your sweetness, and your hope? Or is Jesus? How would you answer that?
It is Jesus through Mary.
Okay. Yeah. But that's
Mary,
not what it says.
Mary points to Jesus.
Yeah. Well, that's a theology, right? And that theology that you said actually got better articulated at Vatican II. Thank God. That was one of the great things we said in Vatican II. We had a section about Mary. And I don't know if you know this. How do I get out of this share? There were a lot of voting sessions going on throughout Vatican II. The one vote that got the closest, in which it kind of missed it, it could have gone into one side or the other, had to do with Mary. This is good coffee. This is good cocktail conversation, trivia. Okay, and it had to do with this. They were debating whether there should be a whole separate document for Mary, basically, or should Mary be part of another document? And some people would say, no, Mary, it's mostly in our tradition, Mary ought to have her own document. So there would have been a 17th document that came out of Vatican II. Other people were debating, well, no, Mary still is not God. Mary should still be seen on the side of the church, And so they decided in the end to put Mary in the side of the church, and there's a section in Lumen Gentium that talks about Mary. But anyway, it's an interesting trivia, because in some ways it was kind of lowering Mary from being the fourth person in the Trinity to sort of seeing Mary as a disciple, like one of us. I mean, probably a model disciple, in some ways a premier disciple of Jesus, right? But still see Mary in front of us. But this prayer, I think if you say something like, yeah, it's Mary through Jesus, that's still not what it says. The actual words are, Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, hail our life. It doesn't say, hail our intercessor through Jesus. It says, hail our life, our sweetness and our hope. So, in other words, there were moments in our prayers. I'm not saying this is an evil prayer. I still pray it when I lead rosaries for people, It says something about the way we looked at Mary as being, an important part of anything. It's a beautiful prayer that talks about the whole, the whole role of Mary in some ways. And if you think about it too, and I'm going to talk about this with number 10 of the Constitution, it does talk about in the end the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. So it does get to Jesus eventually, right? But it's still directed to Mary. And some theologians might say, well, no, Mary is not my life, my sweetness and our hope. God is, or Jesus is my life. Mary is an important part of my life, but she's not my life, right? Just to make you think. And there are a lot of things like that in our Catholic prayers that you need to just kind of look at and see how, maybe see them. They might have been written before Vatican II, but because of this is where social scientific tools come in handy, because of our better understanding, we don't want to say Mary's not important, so we retrieve it to go to post-Vatican II understanding, kind of put it in better perspective, better theological foundation. And it is better theology. But
don't we use that? Don't we use this way of speaking in other regards? Like, for example, I would say that my children are my life. I would say that my wife is the center of my life, right? Now, they're not my God, right?
Right.
But they are so central to my life.
Right.
And move me in every decision I make is in relationship to them. And so is it possible that Our Lady could be, in a spiritual sense that way?
Yeah, that's an excellent example. And like I said, when I talked to a lot of parents, Jeremy, they also said that too. They talked about their children, Sometimes, so what you're bringing now, of course, is what? You make this a little bit more contextualized, right? Because there might be a different moment of the day, different time of the life where your children is your life. Maybe at this moment, because that's what's foremost in most parents would sacrifice their lives for their children, right? For that very purpose. So sometimes, what I'm trying to say is, of course, and that's probably how we look at this, because it is in the context of praying the rosary, right? But then sometimes we take these phrases and sometimes we keep repeating them without sometimes realizing how it might also form us to misinterpret it in other occasions. And that's what Peter Fawn is going to do. Peter Fawn will be the theologian who's going to say, well, wait a minute, let's look at this phrase, the Mass or the liturgy or the Eucharist is the source and summit of Christian life. And he's going to say, well, yeah, in some ways it is, but then in other ways, do we misinterpret it? Or can it be, or can Eucharist still be the source and summit, but then we have to nuance it to meet the other, to kind of address the other concerns, the other issues of how it might be misinterpreted, per se. That's what theologians essentially do. You kind of say, okay, this is the received tradition, but then how do we go deeper into it? The theologians that kind of get divorced from it completely, well, they'll just get excommunicated. But the ones who actually probe the deeper tradition, in light of the received tradition, but also in light of the received theology that's been going on presently, will then have to somehow come up with, might there be a better way to say this without getting rid of tradition, basically. So that's what Peter Fawn's going to do with this phrase, source and summit. And what happened in Vatican II is that we had a phrase, in the Constitution, and the exact first time it appears, it says this: nevertheless, the liturgy is a summit, and there's a Latin word, culmen, toward which the activity of the Church is directed, At the same time, it is a source. Some people, because in Latin it's fonts, but even various official documents, even today, even in the Vatican website, they have different translations of fonts. So sometimes it's source, sometimes it's font. Other times it's fount, F-O-U-N-T. I should have put that there. Even in the Vatican website. So at the same time, it is a source or font, depending on what document you're looking at, from which all her powers flow. So the liturgy is the summit toward which the activity of the church is directed. At the same time, it is the source from which all her powers flow. And you begin to get an image, right? For the aim and object of apostolic works is that all who are made sons of God by faith and baptism should come together to praise God in the midst of his church, to take part in the sacrifice, and to eat the Lord's Supper. A year later, with the next document, Lumen Gentium, they brought that up again. And of course, it's interesting, now that I work with the bishops, sometimes when we're actually writing the actual documents, the official documents, when it comes to footnotes and references, we always want, one of the first recourse we have is what's been said before. So you'll see that in all, if you ever read the endnotes or the footnotes of any official document, it'll talk like for example, I just worked on one on the for Asian Pacific Catholics, which was approved last year. And so we would reference Welcome the Stranger, we would welcome Harmony and Faith, which was a document back in 2001, all these different things. But then it's interesting, if you look at this number a year later with Lumen Gentium, knowing that the Constitution was already approved, they get a little bit more specific. They say taking part in the Eucharistic sacrifice. So it's not just liturgy, but Eucharistic sacrifice, which is the source and fount, and summit, some translations of apex, which is in the Vatican website, of the whole Christian life. So it's a little different. It's not just the liturgy, but the Eucharistic sacrifice. They offer the divine victim to God and offer themselves along with it. And there's a larger context. You have to read that where it's coming from. It's talking about all of Christian life and how we're in the world and how we come to pray. And the next time within Vatican II, there was another document in 1965, and it was directed towards the priests and about priests. So, of course, through a clerical eyes, it says, in this light, the Eucharist shows itself as the font and the summit of the whole work of preaching the gospel. So it's in the context of preaching. But even then, now it just says the Eucharist is the font and the summit. And pretty much what you're saying, Jeremy, the different context is giving different nuances. Different context of the overall document is giving nuances of these. What happened is that after Vatican II, in my own research, there were so many different popular and general metaphors. And all of these are just a sample of some of the writings by theologians and pastoral theologians. Bishops, even today, you might even hear them talk about the Mass as the source and summit. They'll kind of truncate all of this together. And based on my research, it came down to this phrase at the top. That should be an inverted quote. Liturgy, some people will say the Eucharist, is the source and summit of Christian life. As a generalizing metaphor that most people use today. Yeah. Usually, in my experience, when people are giving talks about the Mass, they'll always bring this up as a way to kind of show the importance of Mass, that you should be coming to Mass, that you have to come to Mass because it's a source and summit of Christian life. Or usually you'll hear that when people are trying to just explain what the Mass is about and why it's a once a week thing. So that's usually the metaphor we have. This once a week thing is what we're aiming for. So what Peter Fund talks about, he gives a history of this phrase in Vatican II. So there was a commission, and they would, before they wrote the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy, they had various different versions of it. And while the verses were going on, they were debating about this. Some of the bishops said the summit and goal and activity of the church was not the liturgy, but was the salvation of souls and the glory of God. That's the summit and goal, not liturgy, not going to Mass, but my salvation and glory to God. I mean, it kind of makes sense while those bishops were kind of looking towards that. Another said the highest virtue was not religion, but love. Love is more important than liturgy. So some other people were talking about. Other people are saying liturgy was rather a means than an end. In other words, liturgy was the means, the fountain being Christ and the Holy Ghost. So these are the people who are saying, no, Christ is the source, right? Christ is the source and font, and liturgy is an important, probably the most important means, I would argue, to get to Christ. Okay? Other people said the liturgy, as it was presented in this article, appeared here only. It wasn't really explained in number 10 per se, like why. But Peter Fahn's point is that it was very much debated, a lot more. And there was another one I forgot to mention. Other people said liturgy is not the source and summit because baptism is actually more fundamental than the Eucharist. People said you can't celebrate the Mass until you yourself are baptized. You know, so some bishops actually baptism is really more important. So why are we seeing liturgy? So, and this is what I'm talking about in my whole book. You can read that maybe if you want, if you're ever bored to death. But number 3 kind of talks about the whole history. Chapter 2 kind of talks about the whole history, why we got this phrase, the liturgy is the source and summit. And as I was saying, there was this interrelationship going on with the official church trying to distribute this. So Peter Fahn, what he wants to do, he's a theologian. He teaches in Georgetown University. When he wrote this book, he was, or this particular chapter, he was writing in Catholic University. What he wants to do, he wants to broaden the scope and spectrum of what constitutes liturgy. So because the document says liturgy, he wants to kind of talk about another understanding of liturgy that broadens the scope and spectrum of liturgy. And he calls it comes from Karl Rahner, and we'll talk about this theology, the liturgy of life or the liturgy of the world. So what he proposes is that the liturgy of life is the source and summit of the official liturgy. So in other words, and I'm going to show you with some diagrams, maybe I could show it now. What he's trying to show is more like, I'm just trying to get it to the end here, that he wants to kind of move from this understanding, liturgy is the source and summit of Christian life, to this understanding. The liturgy of life, which includes the official, which is the most important liturgy we could ever celebrate, interrelating with the worship activities of every day. Together, both of these point to the source, the true source and fount of my life, God. Or as a theologian, I might actually say more the triune God, which means Christ or the Holy Spirit. So that's what he's trying to get at. But what he argues is that, he first says, even before that, there's nothing wrong per se with the phrase, because he kind of says how the liturgy could be seen as the source and summit of Christian life. And if you look at your this document, the handout I gave you, and just go to number 10. I kind of bold these other areas because it kind of says number 10, which is what we're talking about, is placed really within this larger context of these other numbers. It's the first part of chapter 1. And when most people use this phrase, liturgy is the source and summit of Christian life, they kind of forget about what the other numbers around it talk about. For example, number 9 says the sacred liturgy does not exhaust the entire activity of the church. The liturgy is not the only activity we can do in worship, for example. It talks about other forms. But this is what I really want to talk about. Here's number 10 again. And look at this last phrase. the last sentence that most people leave out. From the liturgy, therefore, and especially from the Eucharist, as from a font, grace is poured forth upon us, and our sanctification in Christ and the glorification of God, to which all activities of the Church are directed as toward their end, is achieved in the most efficacious possible way. What Peter Font is saying is that we can actually say that the liturgy is a source and summit of Christian life if we realize that the end of all that is not the liturgy, but the glorification of God and the sanctification of people. This is actually one of the insights of Vatican II and liturgy. It kind of brought back this idea of realizing that in the end, liturgy is about how we glorify God. Then how God, in light of our glorification of God, sanctifies us, sends us graces, blesses us. It's that two-way direction per se. But what Peter Font kind of talks about is that by not understanding that, what has resulted is that we have three theological misinterpretations and pastoral applications. He kind of says also that what this happens in our parishes, that we think that this 1 hour every Sunday is going to do everything for us. So after communion, every group wants to do announcements. In other words, there's a sense that we put all the eggs of our Christian life to this 1 hour of Sunday. And what they forgot is like number 9 of the Constitution, which kind of talks about the liturgy is not the only activity. There are other things. So there were 3 criticisms he has of that phrase, liturgy is a source and summit. He says the image of a summit is one of them. This hierarchical emphasis on liturgy as summit leads us to devalue all other worship practices. He doesn't say we had to get rid of it, but we tend to then we tend to devalue other worship practices, and in my chapter before this, I kind of talk about how the clergy began to look down on popular devotions. That happened immediately after Vatican II as well. A lot of devotions, a lot of the sense of adoration, or anything like that, if it wasn't liturgy, we would kind of devalue everything else below this hierarchy. He's not saying that there is no hierarchy. Of course, liturgy is the most important liturgy we celebrate, but we have to be careful of not completely devaluing other worship practices per se. He also says the image of a font could be problematic. The fountain, or fons, or source, in this case font, it's a one-way relation between the original source and the body of water that flows out of it, from top to bottom. This image systematically excludes any possibility of fecundation. In other words, we can be so focused on the top that we forget about how, for example, how things flow to the top, which a fountain does not really show. So in other words, what it does is that it kind of creates this. We have a tendency then of just focusing on the top without realizing what leads to the top, what surrounds the top. I mean, in this case, it might be clouds, it might be moisture, it might be other things. There are other ways, in other words, that also lead to from the bottom to the top. And then he also tells us that it also sets up this metaphor that there were 2 distinct, and I want to emphasize distinct as if it's really hard boundaries, worlds between the secular and the sacred. This views Christians as living in 2 different and separate worlds, the secular and the sacred. The larger world, the world of everyday life, the world of Monday through Saturday, and even the greater part of Sunday is secular and devoid of grace, because it is only nature and worse, fallen and sinful. So we'll tend to not see anything outside of Sunday. We don't see it in balance or in proper alignment to how the other days of the week could also be where God is present, per se. Again, it's not saying that Sunday is less important. Sunday is the most important day of the week. It's a day of rest. But sometimes, if we focus too much on that, we also forget to realize that God is also present in every other day of the week. That's what he's primarily saying. It also doesn't say that we don't have boundaries. or hierarchy of what days are more important than others, but we just have to always be conscious of the other areas. And when we tend to overemphasize one area, which is what he's saying, over time, this phrase made us believe that everything comes down to Sunday in 1 hour. So he's saying also here, in the important centrality of Mass, I guess I want you to read what I'm saying. The goal is not to diminish the importance or centrality of the Eucharistic liturgy in the life of the Church. He goes, on the pastoral side, Sunday Masses are the focal point around which the life of the parish revolves. It's a gathering point, the ritual gathering point that we do every Sunday. And it also says, it's the idea that, of course, Sunday is important. And as a liturgist, I want people to come to Mass, If in fact, people don't do it enough, as the statistics show. 3/4 don't go to Mass frequently, per se. So he's not devaluing Sunday. But what he's trying to say is there a better metaphor of Eucharist as source and summit that can still hold on to our tradition of showing the importance and centrality of the Mass as a center of our ritual when we come together, but still is able to be interrelated with everyday practices that we do. That's what he's after. And so he looks to Ronner primarily as really the foundation, theological foundation. And Ronner kind of was always questioning this idea of seeing the Mass as the peak of Christian life, because that mentality, I pointed this out before, if you recall that history, made us exclusively think that only God comes down for 1 hour out of the 7 days. And Rana develops this whole theology of grace, seeing God really everywhere. And within that, what Rana will say is that what Mass are those moments throughout the world, because Mass is always being celebrated, when we explicitly express and come together publicly to voice what we are already experiencing in everyday life. Okay? So Mass are the explicit and intentional communal public worship gatherings when the body of Christ, encounters the risen Christ, into which we all been baptized, per se. But on the other hand, what Rhonda was trying to say, though, is that all of us, he uses this wonderful phrase, that all of us are kind of like meant to be mystics in the world. We're meant to be in touch with God's grace in every moment of our lives, per se. There was a phrase my mother taught us. So we were 6 children growing up. And when it came to cleaning the house, we kind of had a very lived-in, we weren't messy and filthy, but we kind of had a lived-in approach to cleaning the house. It was never filthy, actually, but it was lived in. And my mother would say, in order to get us to clean, that cleanliness is next to godliness, right? Did you ever hear that? Cleanliness is next to godliness, which I think actually has Calvinistic roots. But anyway, but that was her way of getting us to clean. Now, again, these phrases form us for better and for worse. In this case, my mother had a good intention, nothing evil in her part. But when I thought that cleanliness is next to godliness, that means if it wasn't clean, that means God was not there. In my childhood imagination, that meant God was not there, right? Because if cleanliness is to godliness, what happens when I put my, gym shorts or books and I scatter it without cleaning up? That means I'm not really honoring God's presence. So I remember when I was young, not young, teenager, late teens, seeing this documentary or film report about Mother Teresa. And I'm seeing Mother Teresa, this woman, this nun, and she's there in Calcutta in the midst of dirt and filth. And I remember having this sort of like uncanny, I was kind of like surprised, because it wasn't reconciling with my understanding of cleanliness. That somehow Mother Teresa, that in Calcutta, God was not there because all of this filth is there, this dirt, this poverty. And of course, Mother Teresa represented to me that God was there. My point is, as we all know, God is everywhere. God is everywhere, even in filth, even in dirt. Everywhere. There are even theologians who are beginning to write about how God is present in the internet. Okay? Because God is everywhere. God is omnipotent. But what Rhonda was talking about was this theology of seeing Mass as the end-all and be-all kind of led to this understanding, this picture, as opposed to this approach. And there are a lot of pastoral problems that could come out of that. For example, and when it comes to stewardship, I know I have a good friend, Dolly Sokol, who has a doctorate degree in stewardship. And she formed part of one of the board members. I was a board member of several organizations. She was one of the board members. And she goes, we Catholics should not have to tell people to contribute or give money for, time, treasure, right? Time, treasure, and talent. That should be a given. It shouldn't be like they have to, it should be a given that they're kind of supporting financially the goal of the reign of God, right? That we shouldn't compartmentalize it. That if we really had this understanding, is what she was getting at, that God is everywhere, the reign of God is everywhere, then what should follow is this idea that if God is everywhere, then of course I should be continually praying, continually giving, continually promoting the reign of God. Of course, there are times when we come together explicitly and intentionally to celebrate what's already going on around us, but we shouldn't just limit God in our Catholic imagination to just this 1 hour per se. So that's part of the pastoral challenges that Peter and I are talking about as we approach this. And part of the reason too, to qualify, we're not saying Mass is not important, but we simply want to put Mass in the context of this, while still keeping it and making it remain important. So, and this is what Peter Fahn talks about ultimately, this idea of the liturgy of life, how the liturgy of life interrelates all worship practices. Some of them are approved, some of them are not approved by the officials, but then that's where most Catholics are. So we have to know how do we take what's not approved, and how does that interrelate with official worship? That's what I'm after. What do people do? How do they process the non-approved worship life? Like you'll never see in a Catholic document yoga per se, because that's not an approved form of spirituality for the Roman Catholic Church. But yeah, many Catholics do it. For example, I do Tai Chi because of my Chinese background, the way I was taught, but I kind of Christianized it. When I do Tai Chi, I go through my own mantra per se. Most Catholics might not do that. Or maybe they do. That's what I wanted to find out. I wanted to interrelate official and non-official worship practices with the liturgy, i.e. official worship, and call that as a combined the liturgy of life, but then ultimately come to this diagram, that the liturgy of life, which includes the official worship, within which the Eucharist is the most important liturgy we celebrate, combined with everyday worship practices, where real life Catholics, whether they go to Mass or not, which they do. And as a social scientist, I want to sort of say, why are they doing what they're doing? I could teach them, and we do up until confirmation, but they leave. That's not working. That's all we do. We need more data. So let's find out how they interrelate both of these. And then ultimately come to, which is what the last chapter does in my book, talk about, well, how does this all still come down to the end goal, the glorification of God? Okay. Any questions based on that, what I just said? Lena, we haven't heard from you. Do you have any thoughts or anything to kind of pull you out? And I'm
Taking
not
a break over here because I raised my hand a couple of times, but I'm good.
Okay, so I can't really see with these small windows, so I apologize for that. So,
Okay.
yeah, I guess so I don't know how to do that. If I don't see you, can you just say, oh, it's tough, because some people, like I'm an extroverted thinker, I'll just keep like talking or I'll interrupt others. Sorry about that. So anyway, that's why I'm conscious about it now. What say thee then?
I can't even remember. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well,
I'm just listening.
all right. Is there anything else about this that might strike you? It's just an invitation.
Well, there was something, Father, that it was on page 19 from Helen, saying doing something from her is her form of everyday worship. She says the way I worship is not necessarily true prayer, but more through service. Wait, it's not necessarily, but more through service. I find I try to anchor my week's activities on the teachings of the Gospels. That's why I really like going to church. Well, I found that interesting that she did not consider her service as a type of prayer.
Right.
Because I looked at that and I was saying, well, that's one of the ultimate types of prayer.
Right.
You know, other than, just that, no, she was living the life. She was living that life of prayer.
I think for Helen, if I recall, and I studied each of these people for two and a half years, but for her, prayer had more of an official understanding of going to Mass, per se. Mm-hmm. So for that, whereas in the opposite spectrum, Irene, the young adult couple, the millennial, I'll call them Irene and James, they did a lot of social justice service. So did Helen, actually. So for them, it wasn't about going to Mass, but it was about them reinterpreting official language to seeing that their social justice concerns was their way of being Catholic.
Right. Well, but her husband's not even Catholic. Her husband's Jewish.
I don't remember that, actually.
No, that's a different couple, Marie.
Yeah, that's a different couple.
No, on page 29.
Oh, you're talking about Helen then. Helen's husband is Jewish. Yeah. I was talking about Irene and James.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. No, James.
That was his. Well, Helen is the young wife of the Jewish Jewish husband.
Yeah, I was talking about Irene and James. But and actually for Helen, a lot of her understandings of worship was that whenever she was doing social justice, that was a form of prayer, physical prayer.
No, well, she wasn't saying. Well, it struck me because she said, "I worship." The way I worship is not necessarily true prayer. I find that interesting that she doesn't consider it prayer. Yeah. Because I don't know. I guess she has a different. Yeah. Anyways, that just struck me. It was like, okay.
Yeah, like I said before, I want you all to just think about what are your everyday worship practices. Those times where you intentionally, explicitly or silently praise God or thank God or be angry at God or just think of God consciously. What are those?
I try to think of God when I'm driving.
Yeah.
So I'm not irritated with the drivers around me.
That was very big for what's her name? For Rachel Pignette. She would really do she would drive, but that was her time to be alone with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, our discussion on Liturgy of the Hours has reminded me to start praying to James and Claire and now Joseph, my wife. We're we pray other prayers, but I've restarted praying night prayer together. So
Yeah. Well, that's good. I love night prayer.
yeah, and it's short enough that it's realistic, but it's long enough that you're entering into prayer.
Yeah. And I wonder, I don't know if I said this, but I wonder if we were able to promote the Liturgy of the Hours better, and people practice that, then we actually have a way of participating in official liturgy on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour. You know what I'm saying? But many parishes don't have models for that, you know. And so anyway, I think that I just think that has something to do with this. So since they're not getting it there, they're going elsewhere. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's another way of looking at this.
Our parish actually have one of the deacons prays morning prayer one day a week, and then night prayer one month. But it's something, you know.
Right.
Gotta start somewhere.
One of my professors said, the day that all Catholics show up in the church and they pray the evening prayer too for Easter Sunday. And Sunday evening, he goes, the day that all Catholics do that is the day all liturgists could go home because they did their job. They could pack their bags. It's the idea that they got the liturgy, the official liturgy of the hours in their everyday lives, right? You know, that's not going to happen yet, is it? Because most people, you know, I mean, just to get them to Mass. But even in a pastoral context, by the time you're done with the Easter Masses, the pastor's exhausted. Everyone just goes, they go home, you know, and we Catholics have kind of, I think I said that before, we kind of make it like the Lord's hour. It's supposed to be the Lord's day, you know? So, you know, I really like that. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But, you know, that's actually the official ending of the Triduum. The official ending is not the noon Mass on Easter Sunday. It's actually evening prayer too. You know, I mean, as a main pivot one, one could say night prayer, but as a main pivot one, it's evening prayer, as far as a communal gathering. So, and there are some parishes that do that actually across my travels that I run across in my travels. Not a lot, but a lot that do. They're usually smaller communities too that are a little bit more controllable.
So that's the Easter Triduum on Easter Sunday.
That's right. So Easter Triduum begins with Holy Thursday, right?
Right.
So it's always a good trick. It's always a good question. And when does it end? Some people say Easter Sunday Mass. No, actually, officially, the liturgy is evening prayer as a community.
Evening prayer.
Yeah, evening prayer too.
So would that be Vespers then?
It is. That's right. But for Easter Sunday, you have absolutely. That's another word for evening prayer. Hi. Anything else? We could end a little early. All of these talks, all of these classes are kind of being interrelated themselves. We're going to be talking about the nuns next Wednesday, and you know, I think there's something we can learn. I think the title of my talk is "What the Nuns Could Teach Us About Catholic Faith." In other words, we need to learn why are they leaving?
Mm-hmm.
What can that teach us about our Catholic faith? You know. And then I'm also gonna give some thoughts about I'm gonna give some pastoral suggestions of how we look at this generation, you know, that doesn't go to Mass, because that all pertains to liturgical spirituality. They're not coming to Mass per se. So I give my own thoughts with that, about, you know, what we can do with that, and how we can evangelize the nuns, and not just nuns. That's kind of a generic term, but you can say whether you want to use lapsed Catholic or whatever. Where's the evangelization in that? And part of it, again, is not so much to judge them as much as it is to first understand why they're doing what they're doing. So we'll talk about that as well. Right? Then I'll give some more of my comments in your discussion forum. I didn't have time today. Thanks for those who told me that you handed in a paper. So actually, I could respond to your discussions now since I didn't respond to any of them. But I'll do that today or tomorrow. I'm going to be in New York City next week, so hopefully there won't be a lot in our mother house, St. Paul, the Apostle Church. But so it'll be 10 o'clock my time. But I think I'll still be in California time because I'm not getting there till Sunday or a Monday night, so I'll be fine. But if you hear a lot of traffic outside, hopefully I'll try to do what I can to find a quiet place. I'm just praying that the Wi-Fi is good. I think it is, so I could do this. Okay. All right. God bless. You have I gave you my comments and a lot. I gave each of you at least 5 resources. You know, some of you, I think Marie, I gave you like 20 resources because you're doing the whole funeral liturgy. So those things. But if there's something you might be looking for as well, let me know. You know, I'll see if I can find anything like that. And the reason I'm doing that, because I just want you to write a good paper. And if you don't have access to resources, I'll do that for you. You know, my intention is for you to, you know, to really write a good paper based on.
You recommended Peter Fan from my paper.
Yeah.
But you didn't give me a response to where I could find that resource. Should I just not use it and just?
I actually attached it, and I said in my email, actually, in my comment, that's actually Peter Fan edited it, but the actual writer was Zimmerman. So it's there.
Okay, I got the Zimmerman ones. I just didn't see Peter Fan's name on there.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
I usually do the first page, which includes all that. But yeah, it's there.
Okay, I got it.
Okay, everyone. God bless. I'll still
Thank
be in
you,
touch
Father.
if you're traveling. If you ever want to talk.
Okay.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Have good
Bye-bye.
travels, Father.
Yeah,
Thanks.
safe travels.
Thanks. I'm not leaving until Monday or Sunday.
I know, but we won't see you till then.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
However, I'll tell you.
Continue the discussion. For those who didn't do anything last week, that can go until Saturday. All right.
Great.
Okay.
Bless.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
God bless
Good night,
everybody.
everyone.
Night, everyone.